So welcome out to session number 33, September the 19th, 2023. So just a few days left of summer, and it feels so good in the mornings and evenings. And even during the day, it doesn't feel too bad as long as you close your eyes and don't look at all the dust being swept up in the orchards and the cornfields being harvested and throwing up all their dirt. So we like this time of year as the temperature starts dropping, but I think September and October might be the dirtiest air months, even though we love the rest of those those connected to those months. So we're going to close out the book of Matthew in tonight and next session. And I gave you two handouts, and we're going to go through some of that tonight and the rest the next session. The verse that we're going to read to start is the last verse in Matthew that we'll deal with on the end times. And it's a real interesting one in Matthew 26. Jesus is facing the Sanhedrin Council just before his death, and they keep trying to get him to answer in such a way that he can be rightly accused. They're desperately trying not to break as many laws as possible. They're already breaking some laws. But, you know, they have to salve their conscience to try to get him to incriminate himself. And so they ask him questions, and they try to find witnesses, and they finally had to pay witnesses because no two witnesses would agree. It's like these are supposed to be the smartest guys in the nation. And then they have this like kangaroo court. They can't get the witnesses to agree. They're all confused. You think, they're not maybe as smart as they think they are. So it's on the verge of like falling apart. And Jesus rescues them. I don't know if you kind of see it this way, but the high priest asked him directly in verse 63, after Jesus had been silent all this time, the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. You're like, oh, Mr. Righteous. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus bails him out. He said, it is as you said. Yes, I am. That's what they were looking for all along. Just a direct statement that they could accuse him. And but then he goes on to say, nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Well, that's all they needed, because when Jesus said that, sitting at the right hand, coming on the clouds of heaven, if you look at this sheet where I have the clouds, thief, and trumpets in three different columns, we're not going to get to this tonight, but if you go down about halfway down the column on clouds, it's Daniel 7, 13, and 14. Jesus is basically quoting that. And so all the Jews knew that that figure in Daniel 7, 13, and 14, where he's at the right hand of the Father, so it's the Messiah, and then he's coming on the clouds of heaven. So clearly, all the Jews looked at that as one of the primary prophecies of the coming of their Messiah. And so when Jesus basically said, you know, over there in Daniel 7, 13 and 14, that's me. You're looking at it. They just went crazy, frothing at the mouth. You know, later we'll find they began to spit on him. They began to slap him. They did all sorts of horrible things to him because he equated himself with that Son of Man figure in Daniel 7, 13, and 14. They knew exactly what he meant when he said this. And so they just went berserk. High priest tore his clothes, you know, all dramatic. He has spoken blasphemy. Of course, he said, I'm the one that Daniel's talking about in those verses. So that's going to be our last verse, but that's all I'm going to say on the cloud coming tonight. We'll deal with that in the thief aspect next session. But I wanted to start with deal with the trumpets tonight. And the reason I wanted to deal with the trumpets, and you notice how I have this laid out? The first verse in each column is from Matthew. Because as we went through Matthew, we really didn't deal with the thief aspect in Matthew 24, 43, and 44. We really didn't deal with the trumpet aspect in Matthew 24, 29 to 31. And tonight I read the cloud aspect in 26, 64. So to close out Matthew, we're going to look at these three verses in Matthew and then broaden it to the other verses throughout the Bible that deal with each. This is one of my favorite parts of the end times and the return of Christ, are these three descriptive terms. He's coming in the clouds, he's coming as a thief, and he's coming with trumpets. It really nails down some very important things about the return of Christ. And another thing it does, if you look at these three columns just in general, many of the verses are from the Old Testament. So it's a real simple way to lay out the verses dealing with each of these three aspects to show that the New Testament writers, I say this so often, I feel like a stuck phonograph, the New Testament writers were simply borrowing language from the Old Testament prophets. They were thinking of particular verses in the Old Testament, bringing them into the New Testament, and either rephrasing them or in some cases directly quoting them, because they were most of the time early on addressing Jewish believers or unbelievers, and some became believers and disciples, people who knew the Old Testament. And so they're drawing from those verses that they're familiar with and bringing them over into the New Testament. I wanted to deal with trumpets first for a particular reason. This last weekend started the fall holy feast days of Judaism, the high holy days, they call them. And it starts with on the first day of the seventh month is the Feast of Trumpets. And that was just this last weekend. Now, we call it the Feast of Trumpets. The Jews call it Yom Teruah. And you'll see that at the bottom of that page. I ask a question. Did Paul, the Jew, Hebrew of the Hebrews, have Yom Teruah, the Day of Trumpets, in mind in 1 Thessalonians 4:16? Of course he did. And then I broaden it a bit, and I want to deal with this. I think it's really important. The Hebrew word teruah, T-E-R-U-A-H, is not the normal word for trumpets. There's a couple of other Hebrew words for a regular trumpet. One of them is shofar, the ram's horn. And then another word for just regular trumpets. But teruah is often translated as trumpets because that's usually the loud sound that's made when there's an occasion for a loud sound. But the word teruah actually just means shout or loud noise. And because a trumpet is normally connected with an event that would require a shout, loud noises, they often translate it, and in context, they are correct, trumpets. But the Feast of Trumpets literally is the day of loud noise. And Paul the Jew, very versed in the Old Testament, when he wrote 1 Thessalonians 4:16, and we'll be coming back to that in a minute, but I have it written over here. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, with the trumpet of God. And the reason I put those three loud words from that verse together is all three of them really mean teruah. You know, people look at that verse, 1 Thessalonians 4:16, and they think, okay, here's the Lord shouting, here's the angel's voice, over here's the trumpet, and they're trying to like figure out each of these three parts of that verse, not understanding what you kind of pick up on fairly easily if you read the writings of Paul quite a bit. You just kind of naturally see it if you read his writings enough. Paul was very fond of repeating himself with adjectives, with action words. It would just, he often would say the same thing in the same verse, but just in a different way. It was Paul's way of emphasizing what he was trying to get across. So when he talks about a shout, a voice, and a trumpet, in his Jewish mind, he's simply thinking teruah. What are three different ways to express the Hebrew word teruah? One is a shout, one is a voice, one is a trumpet. The interesting thing in the Old Testament is that the word teruah is much more often translated as shout rather than trumpet. And I want to read a few verses to show that. And turn over to Joshua chapter 6. I have it written down there for you if you want to take a note. Joshua chapter 6 and verse 5, as they are coming against Jericho, 6:5, it shall come to pass when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, that's the shofar, it's not a regular trumpet, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, but that's not teruah, that's the Hebrew word for trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. And that last shout in that verse is teruah. And you'll find, as it's used throughout the Old Testament of people shouting, it's often connected with the descriptive word great. So I was trying to emphasize it's a really loud shout. But it is connected with the trumpet blowing. So there's a shout and a trumpet in the same verse. Okay, let's look at 1 Thessalonians 4:16 again. There's a shout and a trumpet in the same verse. Paul's just trying to do what the Lord's telling them to do at Jericho. Blow trumpets and everybody shout. He said that's how the return of Christ is going to be. Then down in verse, 20, Joshua 6. So the people shouted when the priest blew the trumpets. The people shouted when the priest blew the trumpets. There's that shout and trumpets again. But the actual word teruah is down further in that verse. The people shouted with a great shout. So again, this emphasis on it's not just a shout, it's a great shout. That's teruah. And so you have these verses scattered throughout the Old Testament of shouts and trumpets mixed together. In Psalm 47 is another one that it puts them together. So in Psalm 47 and 5, these are just things that when you develop a mindset, when you're reading the New Testament, especially with prophecy, when you're reading the New Testament, always have a mindset, where is the foundation for that in the Old Testament? Because it's there. So if you have that mindset and you're reading a verse like 1 Thessalonians 4:16, you start thinking, where would that Jewish Hebrew of the Hebrew Paul, what would he be thinking about in his Jewish Bible, the Old Testament? Well, he'd be thinking about teruah. And so he'd be thinking, okay, I want to emphasize that about the Lord's return. So I'll come up with three different words that all kind of mean the same thing for emphasis. Shout, voice, and trumpet. Psalm 47 and 5, God has gone up with a shout. There's 1 Thessalonians 4:16 says, the voice of an archangel. This talks about the shout of God. That's the shout of Christ, the voice of an archangel. And all I'm trying to say is that sometimes people will say, well, this says the shout of Christ, this says the voice of the archangel, so it's like three different things. No, it's trying to say the same thing three different ways. God has gone up with a shout, the Lord with the sound of a trumpet. So there's a shout and a trumpet. Is that the same in yours, Ruth? Yes. 47:5, a shout and a trumpet. So you start seeing these patterns throughout the Old Testament. There's a shout and a trumpet at the same time. So often what would happen on the first day of the seventh month, what we call the Day of Trumpets. So what is a first day in a Jewish calendar? It's a new moon, always a new moon. What does that mean? It's dark, really dark. Then all of a sudden these trumpets start blowing and the people start shouting because it's the first day of their holy seventh month. And that's how the Feast of Trumpets begins with ancient Jews. The people shouting and the trumpets blowing and it's dark. It's like kind of almost like celebration but confusion at the same time. Very loud day, very noisy day. Let me see, what do I want to bring up next before I move on? I might say about Joshua and Jericho. On the seventh day, 7 priests with 7 trumpets blew 7 times. God defeated their enemy and gave God's people the victory at the sounding of 7 trumpets by 7 priests after walking around 7 times. Is that like theme familiar in the New Testament? Like a series of 7 trumpets, and once the 7 trumpets blow, God defeats the enemies and gives victory to his people. So pick up that story of Jericho and all those 7s, take it over into Revelation 11 at the sounding of the 7th trumpet. And what does it say at the sounding of the 7th trumpet? The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdom of Christ because he's defeated them, and he's going to reward his people. It's similar themes all the way through. And it's so important to connect these different parts of the Bible that way. So the first day of the 7th month, Yom Teruah, the day of noise, and then the 10th day of the 7th month is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And those 10 days to the Jews are called the 10 days of awe, A-W-E. And they are days of repentance. During those 10 days, you're supposed to examine yourself and repent and get right with people and get right with God and all that. Because no one wants to be in bad spiritual shape when the Day of Atonement comes. That's bad news if you are. So those are 10 days of cleansing. So I want to look at some of these verses in the trumpet column. And I want to start with the Old Testament verses. And I want to start with Exodus 19. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of Exodus 19. Exodus 19 is basically New Testament prophecy in a single chapter. This is when they arrive at Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up the mountain to get the law. Tradition says, and I think it's probably accurate, that he went up on Mount Sinai to get the law on the day of Pentecost, what later became the day of Pentecost, or very soon became the day of Pentecost, 50 days after the waving of the first fruit, which is right after Passover. And we know that because it says they came to the mountain in the third month. So Passover is in the middle of the first month. So you're already 15 days into the month. So 15 days left in the first month, 30 days in the second month. So there's 45. And then it says they, well, if I can see it real quick, where does it talk about the third day? Be ready for the third day. Verse 11. So you got 45 days in, and then be ready for the third day. And then after the third day, Moses goes up onto the mountain to get the law. So it's easy to factor in 2 more days within all this. So probably Pentecost is when he received the law, which may not have much meaning to you other than just shows how precise God is, how organized he is. He wants to make sure these things are happening on important days. And this idea of trumpet in verse 13, not a hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot with an arrow, whether man or beast, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds long, they shall come near the mountain. This idea of the trumpet sounds long. Keep your finger here and go to Revelation 10. I didn't even put it on this. Yeah, I did. Revelation 10:7. And we'll come back to Exodus 19. But the wording of Exodus, I think, is borrowed by John in Revelation 10 in verse 7. The other 6 trumpets, it just says the angel sounded. But in the 7th trumpet, it extends it to more than just a short, quick, immediate blast, and then it's over with. It talks about in the days of the sounding of the seventh trumpet. We could almost say it's Exodus 19 when the trumpet sounds long. In other words, it's an extended blast that evidently lasts for days, weeks, months. We don't know for sure, but I think what he's trying to say is there are a number of events that can happen connected to the sounding of the seventh trumpet. It's not just like within an hour, everything at the seventh trumpet happens. There's a number of events taking place. And I take this to mean that that seventh trumpet is sounding for that whole period of whatever days means in this verse. Whatever period of time it's talking about, that angel is sounding the seventh trumpet. So go back to Exodus 19:13, when the trumpet sounds long. And then in verse 16, came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain, and the sound of a trumpet was very loud. So it's very loud and very long. Almost sounds like we're reading the New Testament here. Very loud and very long. And then verse 19, when the blast of the trumpet sounded long and became louder and louder, as if it's not loud enough. In verse 16, very loud. He wants to emphasize it in verse 19. It became louder and louder. So it's long and very loud. And by the way, back in verse 16, the sounding of a very loud and a very long trumpet is connected with thunderings and lightnings and clouds and all kinds of cosmic signs and dramatic effects. Does that sound like verses in the New Testament? It talks about lightnings and earthquakes and thunders and hail and smoke. And it's kind of like whatever was happening on Mount Sinai when Moses went up is a picture of what's happening at the sounding of that loud and long trumpet when Jesus comes back. Exodus 19 is a very prophetic chapter. Then chapter 20 of Exodus, verse 18. Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet. I mean, that's just like, okay, Apostle John, lift this verse up, set it over in the book of Revelation, and maybe add a few more words to it, and it's Exodus 20:18. The mountain was smoking, and when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Do you notice verses in Revelation that describes the same kind of events and people's reaction of fear, drawing back, being afraid of what's taking place? So, similar language. The primary verse that the New Testament writers draw from, I think, is Isaiah 27 and 13. So let's look at that. Isaiah 27 and 13. I guess you almost have to be what they call a Bible nerd to really like enjoy digging all these little pieces of the puzzle out, trying to put them together. These are reasons I understand why casual church members will say, it's too complicated. You got to read too many places in the Bible. You got to try to connect too many different things. So that's why most people say, I don't care when it is. I don't care about the details, just as long as I'm ready. That's kind of like you don't know the day or the hour is the first thing they say. And the second thing they say is just be ready, which is not wrong, but this stuff is in the Bible. It's there for us to put together. It's there for us to try to connect the dots. And I think the Lord wants us to. Isaiah 27 and 13 is, I think, the primary verse the New Testament writers would think of. So it shall be in that day, the great trumpet will be blown. Well, we're going to read in Matthew 24. Jesus quotes this. He says, the great sound of a trumpet. The great trumpet will be blown. I mean, same thing. He's just rephrasing it a little bit, but he's quoting Isaiah. And then it talks about what's going to happen at that point. But this great trumpet being blown in the day of the Lord. That day is the day of the Lord. And then Joel, there's a couple in Joel, if you want to turn over there. And Joel 2 and 1, blow the trumpet in Zion. What happens with the blowing of this trumpet? There is an alarm sounded. Sound an alarm in my holy mountains. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. Of course, the day of the Lord is the actual return of Christ. For it is at hand, which is very common terminology in the New Testament. So Joel wrote about 2,500 years plus, maybe 2,800 years before our day, that the day of the Lord is coming, it is at hand. Because it's so monumental that it's just like it's always pending, always close at hand. Verse 15, blow the trumpet in Zion, consecrate a fast, call a sacred assembly, gather the people. Hey, there's a gathering of God's people, the sounding of this trumpet in Zion. It's a sacred assembly, gather the people. Does that sound like language in the New Testament? He's going to gather his elect from the four winds of heaven. We're going to be gathered to him. 2 Thessalonians 2:1. Concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him. It's going to be connected to a trumpet. Gather the children and nursing babes. Now here's bridal language. Let the bridegroom go out from his chamber and the bride from her dressing room. So verse 15 and 16 is very second coming of Christ language. And it's connected to a trumpet, a gathering of his people, and a marriage taking place. Zephaniah, if you can find Zephaniah, just keep Just keep going toward Zechariah and Malachi and you'll find it. Zephaniah 1, verse 14 through 16. The great day of the Lord is near, so that's how we know it's the return of Christ. It is near, hastens quickly. The noise of the day of the Lord is bitter. There's that noisy part again, that teruah part. There the mighty man shall cry out. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, of course, called the Great Tribulation. A day of devastation and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. There's that language of distress in the atmosphere and in the sky. Day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet and alarm against the fortified cities and the high towers. Need to read one more in the Old Testament. I forgot to put it on this list, so you need to write it down because it's also important. Is Zechariah 9:14. Zechariah 9:14. Then the Lord will be seen over them. His arrow will go forth like lightning. The Lord God will blow the trumpet and go with whirlwinds from the south. One reason why this verse is important, kind of what I was talking about in 1 Thessalonians 4:16. So, Revelation says the seventh angel sounded the trumpet. Well, this says God blows the trumpet. So people try to say, well, it can't be this and it can't be that because one says God, one says it's an angel. It can't be both. The Bible accommodates that kind of language all the time. If God gives the order for the angel to blow the trumpet, it's as if God's blowing the trumpet. You can't really separate them. And people try to do that, especially in a pre-tribulation rapture setting. A lot of terminology will be used that way. Well, it can't be down at the end at the second coming of Christ, because this says that God is blowing the trumpet. That says the angel's blowing the trumpet. So it can't be the same thing. That kind of reasoning often takes place. And I think it's easily overcome. So that's the Old Testament foundation. So when the New Testament writers start talking about the trumpet at the return of Christ, they know where they're drawing it from. It's not just out of thin air. So at the end of that column, I deal with the New Testament verses. And I like this idea, this real simple exercise. There's only 4 primary passages in the New Testament that talks about the coming of the Lord at the sound of a trumpet, and we're gathered to him. So you only have to think of 4 passages to really put a whole story together. And if you just write them down in a row like this, and there's a reason why I put Revelation out of order. Because if we let's go ahead and read them. We're very familiar with them, but let's go over to Matthew 24 and verse 31. The first place it mentions the trumpet in the New Testament. He will send his angels, Christ, of course, with the great sound of a trumpet. Well, we read in Isaiah 27:13, the sound of a great trumpet, or whatever it said over there. He's just kind of rewording the same thing. The great sound of a trumpet, they will gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, when is this trumpet blown that gathers together his elect? Well, verse 29, there can be no disputing the timing of whatever this is. If you have a pre-tribulation rapture position, you'll explain this as tribulation saints or Jewish believers or somebody else is being gathered, that it's not the church saints because they were gathered 7 years earlier. And it really makes it quite confusing when you try to do all that. Who are the elect? Well, the elect is the same elect I guess I should. Boy, I'm breaking in a new Bible, and you think everything's in a wrong place from what you've been used to for like 30 years. Where does it say that if possible, he shall deceive the very elect? It's, what?
23.
23?
24, 24.
Oh, yeah, if possible, even the elect. Okay, so who are the elect that he would almost deceive in verse 24? That's the same elect that he gathers in verse 31. So okay, this elect in 31 is Israel, and this elect in 24 is the church. Okay, come on, it's the same elect. So that helps you understand who the elect are that's being gathered together. And it's immediately after the tribulation. So obviously, we put number one, this trumpet, at the end of the 7 years. And then in Revelation 11, in verse 15, even though it doesn't use the word trumpet, just like 10:7 didn't use the actual word trumpet, but obviously it's the sounding of the seven trumpets. The seventh angel sounded. It was a trumpet that he sounded with. Verse 15, then the seventh angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ. He shall reign forever and ever. And then when it goes on to talk about what happens at that time. There's a resurrection. There's a wrath in verse 18. There's a resurrection, the time of the dead, that they should be judged. There's a rewarding taking place to the saints and so forth. So obviously, the seventh angel sounding is when the kingdoms of this world become the kingdom of Christ. So to me, it's obvious that number two trumpet belongs at the same place immediately after the tribulation. So then the question comes up. This is Jesus, his trumpet. This is John, the trumpet that he talks about. And Jesus and John, their trumpet is clearly at the end of the tribulation. So then the question becomes, does the Apostle Paul, in the two verses, he mentions the trumpet and a resurrection, is he talking about a different trumpet at a different time than Jesus and John? Now, if you just kind of present it that simple, then at least whether the person agrees with you or not, it makes the discussion easy to understand. You're not trying to get real complicated. You're not trying to throw out 1,000 verses. Using the four verses that talk about a trumpet, the coming of Christ, and the gathering to him. Are they all four speaking about the same trumpet? Or is Paul talking about a different trumpet at a different time than Jesus and John? Now anyone can understand that question. Whether they come up with the answer that you would or not is up to them. So let's go to 1 Corinthians 15. In 51 and 52. 1 Corinthians 15, 51 and 52. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised incorruptible, we shall be changed. It's clear there's a resurrection taking place. The translators have it as at the last trumpet. Literally, it is in the last trumpet. And there's a little difference in those two words, but in the last trumpet, comes closer to agreeing with Revelation 10:7 in the days of the sounding of the seventh trumpet. So it's talking about a period of time that all of this is taking place, even though the resurrection will happen in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. All of the events connected to it may be over a period of time. Because at the same time he defeats his enemies and so on and so forth. So there's a number of events involved. So the question then becomes, Revelation had not been written yet, so Paul did not have access to John's description of the seven angels blowing the seven trumpets. I don't think that even matters. I think he already knew about it because the Lord made him aware of things like this during the 3 years in Arabia when he was taught personally by Christ. But be that as it may, Jesus had spoken about a trumpet gathering of the elect. These smartphones. At the end or after the tribulation. Paul would have known that one at least. That teaching of Jesus on the Mount of Olives, they were all familiar with it. They all talked about it. They all had written about it. Whether Matthew had written his book yet or not really doesn't matter. Because the teaching of Jesus on the Mount of Olives was common knowledge. Orally and in written form, whether it was in a finished book or not, really doesn't matter. They all knew what he said. They all shared what he said. The apostles that were there were sharing it with everyone. And so Paul knew about a trumpet after the tribulation and a gathering of the elect. Would he use language of a last trumpet different than the trumpet of Jesus immediately after the tribulation? Maybe put the question in another way. The language of the last trumpet demands there has to be at least one before it, doesn't there? And probably more, because if there's only two, you'd probably say first and second. You wouldn't say last, usually if there's only two. So the idea is the last of a series of trumpets. Now this is a real common verse read in the pre-tribulation rapture position. A real simple question is, if this is the last of a series of trumpets, where are the other trumpets? They're not mentioned at all in the whole Bible. And what is the purpose of a series of trumpets leading up to a last trumpet in a pre-tribulation setting? There'd be no purpose for those trumpets. But there is a series of trumpets in Revelation that ends with a seventh or last trumpet that brings in the return of Christ and the resurrection. So there is a series of trumpets in the Bible, but there's not a series of trumpets with a last trumpet. And then I guess another question would be, why does Paul call it the last trumpet? And yet there's another series of seven trumpets still after it in the future, 7 years later, in a pre-tribulation setting. There'd be a series of seven trumpets that come after the last trump. I mean, just real simple questions that doesn't even have to be argumentative. It just can be inquisitive. What do you, just ask a person, what do you do with a series of seven trumpets that come after the last trump? And where is the series of trumpets leading up to the last trump? If it's not that last series of seven in the book of Revelation, I wouldn't know how to answer that, really. I honestly, in a pre-tribulation position, I wouldn't know how to answer that, I don't think. One more before we look at Thessalonians. We've already dealt with it some. But that word last in 1 Corinthians 15:52, it's the word eschatos. We get eschatology, the end things. But that particular word eschatos, they chose to translate it last. But another way that it's commonly used is the word final, which a last trumpet in a series would be the final trumpet. But I like the word final because if you substitute the word final for last, at the final trumpet, in your pre-tribulation rapture and your belief, then you got to figure out how can it be the final trumpet when there's 7 more still to come? It's the final, but not really the final. So these are things that interest me a great deal. I also have at the bottom of that column, 1 Corinthians 15:54. You'll read in your Bibles, death is swallowed up in victory. He's quoting Isaiah 25:8, and then you look at 25:9, and the whole context of those couple of chapters there is the salvation of Israel. And when is Israel saved? So Paul quotes an Old Testament passage speaking about the salvation of Israel, which everyone agrees is when he comes back at the end of the tribulation. And notice the wording of verse 54. Then shall be brought to pass. Death is swallowed up in victory. So in other words, the events of verse 52 and 53, when do they happen? Well, he says, then it shall come to pass at that time when the resurrection happens, death is swallowed up in victory. But he's quoting a verse about the salvation of Israel that's clearly at the return of Christ at the end of the tribulation. And we'll close out in 1 Thessalonians, because I already read Revelation 11:15-18. 1 Thessalonians 4. So the more I meditate on 1 Thessalonians 4:13-18, because anyone who holds a pre-tribulation rapture position, this will all normally be the first passage they turn to. This is the go-to passage. Now, there's other single verses that are commonly used, but as far as a whole passage describing the series of events, this is it. This is the gold standard for the pre-tribulation rapture. And yet you read through it as you're sitting there reading through it, and you notice there is not a clear time factor even mentioned. So a lot of times people will read this and they'll read it through and they'll say, see, there it is. And I'm looking at it and thinking, well, it's talking about a lot of important things, but it really doesn't say when it happens. You're assuming that it must happen in a pre-tribulation rapture time frame, but it doesn't say that at all. But it does use language of a trumpet in verse 16. So then we have to again ask the question, this Paul writing this, so the same writer as 1 Corinthians, Paul is referring to the last trumpet of the resurrection. Well, is the last trumpet a last trumpet before 7 more trumpets? So it's the same trumpet as he's referring to in 1 Corinthians 15 as the last trumpet. And so you have to kind of work through it, but to me, there's not a clear time order at all. So as I said before, to be honest, it doesn't say it's after the tribulation in this passage. So then you have to look at the particular phrases that are used in it, such as verse 17, we're going to be caught up together with them in the clouds, and we'll deal with that next time, the cloud coming, to meet the Lord in the air. Well, is this being caught up together The same as Matthew 24:31. He shall send the angels to gather together his elect from the four winds of heaven. So you're able to connect particular terminology in this passage to other passages that are clearly post-tribulation and time setting. But to use this passage as definitive of either the pre-trib or the post-trib or the mid-trib, you should not do that. This is a supporting passage with a lot of good information, but the actual timing is not highlighted here. The timing is highlighted in other passages. Okay, let me see if I missed anything that I want to bring out tonight. I think we're just about out of time anyway. Yeah, the timing is pretty good. I think I'll go ahead and close it out, to give you a little bit extra time to comment and ask questions. So let's go ahead and shut it off, Gary.